Okay, so here we go with part 2 of our notes for our week 9, box number 5. We're going to be looking at water pollution. So we talk about water pollution, we all know what water pollution is. We're introducing waste matter or chemicals into water that's harmful, right? It might be harmful to the organisms living in the water, or it could be harmful to us if we're exposed to this water, in a river or a stream, or by some chance we end up drinking this or, trying to eat food that's, growing through this water. Okay, the two underlying causes of water pollution are industrialization. So I briefly mentioned that in our last set of notes, and then rapid human population growth. Okay. So we look at things like sewage and agricultural runoff, right? And so a big push is, to not fertilize your lawns, or if you're going to fertilize your lawns, to use safer methods of fertilization. Technically, anything you buy in a store is not necessarily going to be a safe method of fertilization because they're all going to use chemicals. Okay. And then the chemicals are going to wash away, they're going to enter the groundwater, and all of that's going to end up in, water sources. So we're going to talk about two sources of water pollution, point and non-point sources. Okay, so the first thing with point source pollution is this pollution that comes from a specific site, right? It can be identified and traced to a very specific source. But even though we can do that, enforcing cleanup is sometimes difficult. Non-point source pollution is pollution that comes from many sources. So this would be we consider, our fertilizer on our lawns, or something gets dumped on a street or in a storm sewer and it reaches a body of water. That's going to come from multiple sites, right? It's not coming from one storm sewer or one street or one lawn. But the accumulation of small amounts of water pollution from many sources is a major pollution problem. Okay, so here's some other examples of point pollution and non-point pollution. Okay. Additionally, another slide showing you principal water pollutants in terms of pathogens, organic matter, heavy metals, et cetera, et cetera. All right, when we talk about wastewater, after you turn on your sink and water drains down the sink, it flows through a series of sewage pipes, right? And it goes to a wastewater treatment plant. So wastewater is going to be water that contains waste from our hosts or industry. And the treatment plant, its entire job is to filter and treat the water to make it clean enough to return to a river or a lake. Okay? Most of the wastewater that comes from homes contains biodegradable material, so it can be broken down by a living organism. So wastewater from toilets, your bodily fluids and kitchen sinks contain animal and plant waste, paper, soap, all of those things are biodegradable. Some household industrial water, though, and some stormwater runoff contains toxic substances that can't be. So, if you start pouring bleach in your water or things like that, those things are going to be toxic. I start pouring like ammonium and stuff in my water. We can also talk about sewage sludge. This is going to be the solid material that remains after water treatment, right? So it pulls out all of this kind of nasty, disgusting things, and we get the solid material at the end. And sludge is going to contain dangerous concentrations of toxic chemicals. So it has to be disposed of through hazardous waste disposal, and it's often incinerated, and then the ash is buried in a secure landfill. Now, note that this isn't in the slide, but if you incinerate this, you're burning it. And so sometimes by burning it, you actually release plastic chemicals into the air. Sludge can be an expensive burden to cities, as the volume of sludge has to be disposed of every year is enormous, and you need to do it in a safe way. When we talk about sewage sludge, we also talk about where it comes from. So if the toxicity of sludge can be reduced to safe levels, it can be used as fertilizer, right? Because it does contain, it contains some toxic things, but we're talking about fertilizing, whole areas of land. And so sometimes it could be combined with clay as well to make bricks that are used in buildings. We also have this idea of artificial eutrophication. So most nutrients in water come from organic matter, right? Leaves, animal waste, and that's broken down by our bacteria and our fungi. Nutrients are an essential part of an aquatic ecosystem. So when lakes and slow-moving streams contain an abundance or an overabundance, which we'll see, they're called eutrophic. Eutrophication normally is a natural process. Organic matter builds up in a body of water, begins to decay and decompose. Decomposition uses up oxygen levels decrease. So that will change the type of organism that can live in water over time, right? So natural eutrophication is accelerated when inorganic plant nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen enter through runoff and through sewage. So artificial eutrophication is going to increase the amount of nutrients in the water, and therefore, drastically alter the process that we just talked about with natural eutrophication and the decrease in oxygen levels, and then the organisms that are able to survive. Okay. We've mentioned the phosphorus cycle before, but phosphorus is a plant nutrient that causes excess growth of algae. And so a lot of times what we're going to see is in water polluted by phosphorus, we're going to see these giant like floats of algae called algae blooms. Okay. And as the algae die and decompose, most of the dissolved oxygen is used and fish and other organisms suffocate in the oxygen depleted water. Okay. We can also talk about thermal pollution. We look at this as a temperature increase in a body of water caused by human activity, right? So for one example, thermal pollution can occur when power plants use water in their cooling systems and then discharge that warm water in the lake or river. So, they're using the water to cool off their tanks or whatever, and the water itself gets warm. And, we talked about maybe possibly trying to recycle it, but they just dump it into the natural bodies of water that are used for a particular temperature, but it's warm. And some of the organisms that live in there can't survive in that. Okay. Thermal pollution can cause large fish kills if the discharge water is too warm for the fish to survive. Even if that body of water increases by a few degrees, it can change the amount of oxygen the water can hold. Okay. As oxygen levels drop, organisms may suffocate and die. Okay. Groundwater pollution is something we've briefly mentioned already. This is what we're talking about with our fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. They're common groundwater pollutants when they just enter and they percolate down from the Earth's surface. Okay. We also have underground storage tanks. And so, some houses have oil tanks in the backyard, or you might have septic tanks. And then, companies would have larger ones, but they can leak. So underground storage tanks can leak, and anything that's underground is going to leak into our groundwater. And leaking tanks often can't be repaired or replaced, right, until they've leaked enough for the pollutants to be located. But by that point in time, you could have a major environmental damage done already. Okay, water pollution is one of the most challenging environmental problems because sometimes it's hard to identify and pollution clings to materials. And sometimes, it's just, it's difficult to then replenish the ecosystem in these particular areas once we can get the contaminants out of them. Okay, briefly, we mentioned ocean pollution. So pollutants are often dumped directly into the ocean, right? So ships can legally dump their wastewater and garbage overboard. So we see 85% of ocean pollution is actually oil, toxic waste, and medical waste from activities on land or near the coast. And you can see this beach with all this gross stuff washed up on it. I know a couple years ago, there's a problem at the Jersey Shore with like syringes washing up. So obviously there had been a huge medical waste dump from somewhere. Okay, ocean water is often also polluted when there's accidental oil spills. Okay, so we see big ones on the news, but each year there's about 37 million gallons of oil spilled into the ocean. Okay, and they can have dramatic effects, but they are only responsible for about 5% of the oil pollution in the oceans. Okay. Another thing that I want to mention is biomagnification. So this is going to be the accumulation of pollutants at successive levels of the food chain, right? So if your bottom level of your food chain, ingests some pollutants, we look at what happens as we rise up the food chain in terms of how much stuff is going into the body. And so in some US states, they actually have to limit the amount of fish people can eat from certain bodies of water because it contains too much of stuff that could be toxic and potentially poisonous. The Clean Water Act of 1972 was designed to restore and maintain chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And so, giant percent of lakes, so about 30%, are now fit for swimming, increased by 30% as states passed stricter water quality standards. There are other, the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act of 1972, and then the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. So here is a breakdown of this. But I can tell you, I grew up in, you guys know I grew up in Ohio, and I lived right on Lake Erie, and it was not uncommon to turn on the news in the morning and for them to tell you the fecal count, basically the pollution count of animal and human waste in the lake for that particular day because it was so dirty. Okay, so I hope you were able to work through these notes. Remember, this is your required box of box number 5, and you do have to complete one blue and one yellow box as well for this week.